Hello friends and welcome to Medieval Screen Finds. Tonight, we turn our gaze to the epoch-making clashes between the Anglo-Saxons and the Norsemen, a saga of raids and resistance, of conquest and consolidation, a narrative often painted with broad strokes of violence, but one that, beneath its surface, reveals the quiet, persistent rhythm of human experience. So, before you get too comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where in the world you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights. Perhaps light an incense or two for that soothing fragrance. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. Imagine a time when the world felt both vast and intimately small, when the horizon held both the promise of bounty and the shadow of dread. The land we now know as England was then a collection of disparate kingdoms, each with its own customs, its own rulers, and its own quiet anxieties. Life moved at a different pace, dictated by the turning of the seasons, the tilling of the soil, and the ceaseless vigil against the unknown. Yet, this relative tranquility, this fragile peace, was destined to be shattered by the sudden, terrifying appearance of longships on the horizon, bearing warriors from across the cold, northern seas. Let us begin our gentle descent into the past, not with a roar, but with a whisper, the whisper of distant waves carrying a new, terrifying sound to the shores of Anglo-Saxon England. Our focus for this segment is the initial shockwave sent across the land by the arrival of the Vikings. We will explore the early, terrifying raids that shattered the illusion of peace and laid the groundwork for decades of relentless conflict, emphasizing the profound psychological impact and the gradual, unsettling realization of a new, formidable threat. This was a time when the known world began to expand, not with discovery, but with dread. Picture yourself standing on a windswept island, the air cool and crisp, carrying the scent of salt and damp earth. Before you stands a peaceful monastery, its stone walls weathered by centuries, its inhabitants dedicated to prayer and quiet scholarship. The rhythmic tolling of a distant bell marks the passage of time, a comforting cadence in a world that, for the monks of Lindisfarne, seemed utterly predictable and safe. Life here was one of quiet contemplation, of meticulous manuscript illumination, and of humble devotion. The greatest worries might have been the harshness of a winter storm or the scarcity of a harvest. Then, one fateful day, the familiar horizon offered something new, something chilling. Sails appeared, dark shapes against the pale sky, growing steadily larger, unlike anything seen before. These were not the sails of friendly merchants or visiting pilgrims. A low murmur might have spread through the monastery grounds, a growing sense of unease. As the longships drew nearer, their dragon-headed prows became visible, menacing and alien. The sound of oars, pulling in unison, would have carried across the water a powerful, measured beat that resonated with an unsettling power. The very air would have seemed to thicken with unspoken fear. The first recorded major Viking attack, the brutal assault on Lindisfarne, was not just a raid for plunder. It was a profound declaration. It was a brutal, shocking assault that announced a new era of terror. For those monks, the sudden violence was utterly incomprehensible, a swift, merciless shattering of their ordered world. Imagine the quiet horror as these foreign warriors, with their strange, guttural cries and their gleaming axes, descended upon the sanctity of their sanctuary. The gentle rhythm of their lives, once so secure, was abruptly replaced by the sounds of smashing wood, desperate cries, and the terrifying clang of steel. This wasn't merely a localized act of brigandage. It was a cosmic disruption, a clear sign that the world, as they knew it, was about to change, drastically and violently. The realization that this new, formidable threat had arrived, unannounced and utterly ruthless, would have settled deep into the hearts of survivors, a chilling premonition of the decades of conflict that lay ahead. The quiet echoes of that day, the sense of shattered innocence, would reverberate across the land. Early Viking raids, unlike later invasions, were not about conquest. They were primarily about plunder. Imagine the sheer speed and ferocity of these attacks. The Longships, swift and shallow-drafted, could navigate not only the open sea but also penetrate deep into river systems, striking far inland where danger was least expected. This allowed them to bypass coastal defenses, which were often minimal or non-existent, and to appear as if from nowhere. They moved with a chilling efficiency, descending upon unsuspecting settlements and wealthy, undefended monasteries. The monastic communities, rich in treasures and provisions, and notably lacking in organized defense, were particularly vulnerable. These attacks were fast, brutal, and unpredictable. They would land, seize what they could: silver, gold, livestock, slaves, and then disappear as quickly as they had arrived, leaving behind only devastation and a pervasive sense of dread. The Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, accustomed to a more localized form of warfare between neighboring rulers, were ill-equipped to respond to such swift and widespread incursions. Their forces were often dispersed, and the time it took to raise an army and march to the point of attack meant that the Vikings were often long gone, melting back into the vastness of the sea. This constant, low-level dread, this pervasive sense of insecurity, settled over the land like a persistent fog. It was like a venomous serpent striking from the shadows, its bite sharp and unpredictable. Communities lived with the quiet knowledge that at any moment, the ominous sails could appear, bringing with them a whirlwind of destruction. Farmers working their fields near the coast, fishermen tending their nets, monks in their cloisters, all would have carried this unspoken anxiety, this gnawing fear that their lives could be irrevocably altered in an instant. The very fabric of daily life was subtly, yet profoundly, reshaped by this unseen, omnipresent threat. The sense of invulnerability was gone, replaced by a cautious vigilance and a pervasive, quiet unease. The sound of unfamiliar voices carried on the wind, or the sight of a strange ship far out at sea, would send shivers down the spine. This was not a war of pitched battles, but a war of attrition, fought on the psychological landscape as much as on the physical one. Anglo-Saxon England at this time was not a single, unified entity. Instead, it was a complex tapestry of independent kingdoms, each with its own king, its own laws, and its own distinct identity. Kingdoms like Mercia, Northumbria, and Wessex, while sharing some cultural and linguistic similarities, were often engaged in internal feuds, vying for dominance and influence. Their energies were frequently consumed by petty rivalries and localized conflicts rather than a grand, unified vision. This persistent disunity proved to be a fatal flaw when faced with the increasingly organized and relentless Viking threat. Imagine these kingdoms as individual strongholds, each standing alone, rather than a cohesive wall. The Vikings, with their keen strategic insight, quickly recognized and exploited this fragmentation. Instead of facing a united front, they could pick off the kingdoms one by one, isolating them and overwhelming them individually. For instance, Mercia, once a powerful kingdom, found itself battling Viking forces in the east while perhaps still harboring suspicion towards its Anglo-Saxon neighbors to the west. Northumbria, with its rich monasteries and vulnerable coastline, was particularly susceptible to repeated incursions, and its internal political instability often left it ill-prepared to mount a coordinated defense. Wessex, though it would later rise to prominence, was initially just one among many, often concerned with its own borders and internal power struggles. The quiet testament to the dangers of internal strife became brutally clear as these once proud kingdoms, instead of uniting their forces, often found themselves picked off one by one. The resources that could have been pooled for a common defense were instead squandered on internecine squabbles, leaving them open to a more disciplined and unified enemy. The Longships, cutting through the waves, brought not only raiders but also a stark, chilling lesson in the vulnerability of a divided land. The absence of a central authority, capable of mobilizing a nationwide defense, meant that the response to the Viking menace was often piecemeal and reactive, rather than strategic and preemptive. This underlying weakness, this quiet fracturing of the land, was as much an enemy to the Anglo-Saxons as the Vikings themselves. By the mid-9th century, the nature of the Viking incursions began to shift dramatically. The hit-and-run raids, while devastating, gave way to something far more ominous and systematic: the arrival of what the Anglo-Saxon chronicles termed the Great Heathen Army. This was no mere raiding party, a collection of opportunistic warriors seeking quick riches. This was a massive, disciplined force, a veritable army with long-term ambitions that extended far beyond simple plunder. Their intent was not just to raid, but to settle, to conquer, and to establish permanent footholds on Anglo-Saxon soil. Imagine the sheer scale of this force. Hundreds of ships, carrying thousands of warriors, their numbers dwarfing anything previously seen. They came with their families, their livestock, and their tools, signifying an intent to stay, to carve out new territories for themselves. The sight of such a vast armada, the sheer weight of their presence, would have sent shivers of despair through the Anglo-Saxon populace. This marked a profound and terrifying shift. The threat was no longer transient. It was existential. The quiet dread that had permeated coastal communities now spread inland, reaching every corner of the land. This wasn't going to be a bad few months, a temporary period of heightened danger. This was an entirely new way of life, a permanent alteration of the landscape. The Great Heathen Army established fortified camps, often in strategic locations, from which they launched coordinated campaigns of conquest. They began to dismantle existing Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, systematically subjugating them and installing puppet rulers or directly establishing their own governance. The initial terror of the raiders was replaced by a deeper, more insidious fear. The fear of losing everything, of having one's land, one's culture, and one's very identity absorbed by these powerful newcomers. The storm had gathered, and its thunder now rolled across the entire island, promising not just rain, but an unyielding deluge. The once separate fears of individual raids coalesced into a single, overwhelming fear for the future of Anglo-Saxon England itself. This was a slow-motion invasion, measured and relentless, unlike anything the Anglo-Saxons had ever faced. The Vikings were not merely physically destructive, they were also masters of psychological warfare. Their reputation, carefully cultivated through acts of brutal efficiency, preceded them. Tales of their ferocity, their pagan rituals, which seemed utterly alien and terrifying to the Christian Anglo-Saxons, and their sheer ruthlessness in battle, spread like wildfire across the land. Imagine the chilling effect of these stories, whispered from village to village, embroidered with each telling. The image of the berserker, seemingly impervious to pain, fueled the pervasive dread. This quiet, knowing fear often paralyzed resistance before a single axe was even swung. The mere knowledge of their approach could trigger widespread panic. Communities would abandon their homes, fleeing into the forests or marshes, leaving their possessions behind, rather than face the terrifying prospect of a Viking encounter. The sound of their longships on the water, distinct from any native vessel, became a harbinger of pure dread, a sound that would send a cold shiver through anyone who heard it. The distinctive creak of their oars, the low murmur of their voices carried on the wind, the sight of their formidable prows carving through the waves, these were not just physical phenomena, but psychological weapons. The pagan nature of the invaders added another layer of terror. To the deeply Christian Anglo-Saxons, these men were not just enemies. They were instruments of divine wrath, agents of chaos and darkness. Their seeming disregard for Christian sacred sites, their desecration of churches and monasteries, confirmed their demonic reputation in the minds of many. This amplified the psychological impact, transforming the conflict from a mere territorial dispute into a cosmic struggle between good and evil. This pervasive fear, often unspoken but deeply felt, undermined morale, encouraged flight rather than fight, and weakened the collective will to resist, making the Viking conquest all the more effective. It was a silent weapon, perhaps more potent than any sword. Paradoxically, the relentless Viking onslaught, while initially devastating, began to forge something new and unexpected, a nascent English identity. Prior to the invasions, the various Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, as we have discussed, viewed themselves primarily as independent entities. Their loyalties were to their own kings, their own local customs, and their own immediate communities. The idea of a unified England was largely conceptual, an intellectual ideal rather than a lived reality. However, faced with a common, terrifying enemy that threatened them all indiscriminately, the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, however reluctantly and often begrudgingly, started to see themselves less as separate entities and more as part of a shared struggle. The rage transcended regional boundaries, affecting Mercian, Northumbrian, and Wessex settlements alike. The shared experience of terror, of loss, and of desperate resistance began to knit them together in a way that peaceful alliances never could. Imagine the quiet shift in perspective. A Mercian farmer, hearing news of a Viking attack in Northumbria, might initially have felt a degree of detachment. But as the threat grew, as Viking armies established permanent bases closer to home, that detachment would have evaporated, replaced by a growing understanding that this was a threat to Anglo-Saxons, regardless of their specific kingdom. The need for mutual defense, the sharing of intelligence, and the eventual collaboration in military campaigns, even if sporadic at first, fostered a sense of common destiny. This quiet, desperate necessity laid the first, fragile seeds of a unified nation, born from the crucible of invasion. The very act of standing against a common foe, of enduring shared suffering, instilled a profound sense of solidarity. Though the path to complete unification would be long and arduous, the Viking Age undeniably forced the Anglo-Saxons to confront their shared heritage and their shared vulnerability, prompting the slow, organic growth of a collective identity that would eventually blossom into the idea of England. The dragon's shadow, though dark, inadvertently cast the light on a path towards unity. Our journey now takes us to a pivotal moment, a turning point where the tide of Viking conquest threatened to engulf the last Anglo-Saxon kingdom, Wessex. We will immerse ourselves in the desperate circumstances leading up to the Battle of Edington and explore King Alfred the Great's audacious strategy that, against all odds, saved England from complete subjugation. This was a period when hope seemed a distant memory, replaced by a quiet, knowing despair. Yet from the depths of this despair, a remarkable resilience would emerge. Imagine the quiet desperation that hung heavy in the air, a palpable weight on the shoulders of every man, woman, and child in Wessex. By 878 AD, the Kingdom of Wessex, under the leadership of King Alfred, stood as the final bastion of Anglo-Saxon resistance. The relentless campaigns of Guthrum's Viking forces had pushed Alfred to the absolute brink. The once proud kingdom, diminished and besieged, found itself cornered, its people scattered, its defenses seemingly crumbling under the sustained onslaught. Picture the feeling of being hunted, of constantly looking over your shoulder, of living with the quiet certainty that danger lurked in every shadow. The vibrant heart of Wessex, once beating strong, now felt faint, almost imperceptible. The land, once fertile and secure, became a landscape of fear and uncertainty, where every distant sound could signify approaching doom. Alfred, the young king, was forced into hiding, taking refuge in the desolate, mist-shrouded marshes of Athelney. This was not the grand cot of a monarch, but a humble, isolated sanctuary, a place of quiet reflection amidst overwhelming adversity. Imagine the immense pressure on a king facing total annihilation. The weight of his people's survival, the very continuation of their way of life, rested squarely upon his shoulders. The cold, damp air of the marsh, the constant drone of insects, the isolation, all would have contributed to a sense of profound solitude and a quiet desperation. Yet, in this desolate refuge, away from the clamor of war, a flicker of defiance, a quiet spark of strategic thought, would begin to ignite. The quiet despair was profound, almost suffocating, yet beneath it, a quiet determination began to harden. The fate of an entire people, a culture, a burgeoning identity, hung by the slenderest of threads, teetering on the precipice of oblivion. The silence of the marshes would have amplified the quiet anxieties, the whispered fears, but also the resolute will to endure. From his hiding place in the heart of the marshes, Alfred, against all expectations, did not give up. Instead, he launched a daring guerrilla campaign, a quiet, persistent defiance that spoke volumes of his unyielding spirit. This was not grand warfare with massed armies and resounding charges. This was a patient, methodical form of resistance, characterized by small, swift strikes against Viking outposts and foraging parties. Imagine loyal followers, emerging from the shadows of the fen, gathering around their king in hushed whispers, their faces etched with a grim determination. They were a small, dedicated band, sustained by hope and an unwavering belief in their leader. These weren't large-scale battles, but rather a series of quiet, calculated blows, designed to harass the enemy, disrupt their supply lines, and keep the flame of resistance alive. Each successful skirmish, each small victory, however minor, would have sent a quiet ripple of encouragement through the demoralized populace. This was a testament to Alfred's unwavering spirit and the remarkable resilience of his people, even in the face of seemingly overwhelming odds. The whispers of Alfred's continued resistance would have traveled through the countryside, carried on the wind, offering a glimmer of hope in the pervasive darkness. It was a war fought in the shadows, a quiet, defiant struggle for survival where every small act of defiance contributed to a larger, emerging narrative of resistance. The very act of not surrendering, of continuing to fight from the depths of despair, was a powerful statement in itself. The quiet, persistent defiance slowly, almost imperceptibly, began to gather momentum. As spring arrived, bringing with it a renewed sense of possibility, Alfred made a bold move. He secretly sent out summons, not through official decrees, but through trusted messengers who moved quietly through the countryside, delivering their urgent messages in hushed tones. These summons called his loyal men from across Wessex, from every shire and village, to a hidden meeting point, Egbertstone. This clandestine gathering was a moment of immense risk and profound hope. Imagine the scene: warriors, farmers, and freemen, leaving their homes under the cover of darkness, traveling along ancient tracks and hidden paths, their hearts filled with a mixture of apprehension and rekindled purpose. They would have converged from all directions, drawn by an unspoken loyalty, by a desperate hope that this secret rendezvous might be the catalyst for change. The air around Egbertstone would have been thick with hushed whispers, the quiet murmur of men greeting each other, their voices low so as not to attract unwanted attention. Each man who arrived represented a quiet act of faith, putting their lives and the fate of their families in the hands of a king who, only months before, had seemed to have lost everything. Their determination, though quiet, was immense, a silent testament to their enduring courage and their belief in the possibility of regaining what had been lost. The very act of their gathering, in defiance of Viking dominance, was a powerful, quiet declaration of intent. It was a collective gamble, a moment when individual acts of quiet courage converged to form the fragile beginnings of a unified force. The whispers of the past, of a kingdom that refused to die, filled the air, carried by the quiet determination of men ready to fight. From the secret gathering point at Egbertstone, Alfred's reassembled army, a mosaic of loyal fighters and desperate citizens, began their march. Their destination: to face Guthrum and his formidable Viking forces at Edington. This was not a reckless charge born of desperation, but a carefully planned advance, a strategic maneuver designed to maximize their chances of success. Alfred, now a master of tactics honed in the crucible of guerrilla warfare, aimed to catch the Vikings off guard, perhaps exploiting any overconfidence they might harbor after months of unchallenged dominance. Imagine the quiet anticipation that permeated the marching ranks. The rhythmic thud of hundreds, perhaps thousands, of feet on the ancient earth, a sound that resonated with determination and purpose. The subtle clang of weapons, the rustle of leather and wool. These were the muted sounds of destiny approaching. There would have been little conversation, save for the occasional whispered command or the shared glance of quiet resolve between comrades. Each step was a commitment, a defiant statement against the overwhelming odds. The air would have been charged with a quiet tension, the knowledge that they were marching towards a confrontation that would decide the fate of their kingdom, perhaps even the future of Anglo-Saxon England itself. The landscape, once a place of quiet retreat, was now a stage for a momentous and silent advance. The long, silent march was a reflection of the profound gravity of the moment, a collective journey towards an uncertain, yet critically important, future. The Battle of Edington itself was a brutal, uncompromising clash, a visceral confrontation where the very ground seemed to tremble with the impact. At its heart lay the shield wall, a defining formation of Anglo-Saxon warfare. Imagine two opposing lines of men, packed shoulder to shoulder, their shields interlocking to form an impenetrable barrier. The Fyed, Alfred's disciplined militia, composed of free landowners and their retainers, stood firm against the relentless Viking onslaught. Their courage was fueled not by professional training alone, but by a deeper, more primal force: desperation, loyalty to their king, and the fierce desire to protect their homes and families. We can immerse ourselves in the rhythmic clash of weapons, the heavy thud of axes striking wood and bone, the sharp clang of swords against steel, the dull thump of a shield absorbing a blow. The shouts of men, both Anglo-Saxon and Viking, would have mingled with the strained grunts of effort, the gasps of pain, and the quiet, desperate pleas. This was close-quarters combat at its most grueling, a sheer physical grind where every inch of ground was fought for with a silent, brutal intensity. The air would have been thick with the scent of exertion, of sweat and blood, and the metallic tang of fear. The sun, perhaps, would have shone down on this terrifying tableau, casting long, silent shadows as men struggled and fell. It was a prolonged, attritional struggle, a test of endurance and resolve, where the line between victory and defeat was measured in many inches of contested ground. The sounds of battle were deafening to those within it, yet to an outside observer, they were the grim, silent symphony of a turning tide. Edington was a resounding Anglo-Saxon victory, a triumph born of resilience and strategic brilliance. Guthrum's army, previously seemingly invincible, was utterly shattered, their forces dispersed and their spirit broken. The Viking leader himself, humbled and defeated, was compelled to accept terms, a remarkable turn of events given his earlier dominance. Most significantly, Guthrum agreed to convert to Christianity, a symbolic and politically astute move that underscored Alfred's newfound authority and the shifting power dynamics. This was not merely a win in a series of battles. It was a profound turning point in the long, arduous Anglo-Viking Wars. It secured the precarious survival of Wessex, ensuring that Anglo-Saxon identity and culture would not be completely extinguished. More than that, it laid the essential foundation for Alfred's ambitious vision of a unified English kingdom. The quiet triumph of Edington, while purchased at a terrible cost in human lives, resonated far beyond the immediate battlefield. It offered a renewed sense of hope, a powerful demonstration that the Vikings were not invincible, and that resistance, when united and determined, could indeed prevail. The victory, though punctuated by the sounds of desperate battle, ushered in a period of quiet consolidation and strategic planning, paving the way for the slow, methodical reconquest of lost lands. From the quiet despite of Athelney, Alfred had led his people to a quiet, yet monumental, victory, securing not just a piece of land, but the very future of a nation. Our narrative now shifts to the quiet, determined efforts that followed Alfred's pivotal victory. This chapter brings into focus the children of Alfred the Great, his son, Edward the Elder, and his formidable daughter, Æthelflæd, often known as the Lady of the Mercians. We will explore their systematic and strategic reconquest of the Danelaw, the Viking-held territories in England, emphasizing their innovative use of fortified settlements known as bays and their quiet, relentless advance against the lingering Viking strongholds. This was not a period of dramatic, single battles, but rather a methodical, grinding process of regaining lost ground, built on the foundations laid by their father. Alfred, despite his desperate circumstances and the constant threat of Viking incursions, did not simply win a battle at Edington. He left behind a visionary strategic blueprint for the future. His network of bays, these carefully planned and fortified towns, were far more than mere defensive structures. They were designed as multifunctional hubs, serving not only as places of refuge and military strongholds but also as centers for administration, trade, and economic revival. Imagine these early fortified towns, their earthen ramparts and wooden palisades rising defiantly against the landscape, offering a sense of security in a deeply insecure world. These bays provided the perfect springboard for the slow, methodical reconquest that would follow. This wasn't about flashy victories or grand, heroic charges. It was about a quiet, grinding, strategic encirclement, a patient tightening of the noose around Viking power. Each burh was a fixed point, a quiet assertion of Anglo-Saxon resolve, allowing forces to be gathered, supplies to be secured, and for the local populace to feel a renewed sense of protection. The strategy was one of slow, inexorable pressure, designed to wear down the Viking hold piece by piece, rather than attempting a single, decisive blow. The very existence of these fortifications, radiating a quiet strength, began to reshape the psychological landscape of the formerly Viking-dominated areas. Among Alfred's remarkable children, Æthelflæd, the Lady of the Mercians, stands out as a truly exceptional and often overlooked figure. As the de facto ruler of Mercia following the death of her husband, Æthelflæd, she proved herself to be a brilliant military commander and strategist in her own right. Imagine her, not as a queen confined to a court, but as a leader actively engaged in the brutal realities of warfare. She personally led armies into the field, demonstrating a quiet, unwavering resolve that commanded respect from her seasoned warriors and instilled fear in her enemies. She oversaw the construction of numerous burhs, extending the defensive network and pushing the frontier of Anglo-Saxon control deeper into Viking territory. Æthelflæd's leadership was instrumental in regaining vast swathes of lost territory from Mercia, and by extension, for the nascent English kingdom. Her quiet determination was matched by her shrewd political acumen, as she navigated complex alliances and rivalries with skill. She was a testament to the fact that strength and effective leadership came in many forms, challenging the traditional gender roles of her era. The success of her campaigns, often achieved through meticulous planning and a quiet, persistent application of force, showed that the reconquest was not merely a royal decree, but a tangible, hard-won reality forged by individuals of remarkable talent. Her legacy was not one of dramatic pronouncements, but of quiet, impactful action, steadily turning the tide against the lingering Viking presence. Her ability to inspire loyalty and command armies in a male-dominated world speaks volumes of her quiet, yet profound, power. Edward the Elder, Alfred's son and successor to the throne of Wessex, together with his sister Æthelflæd, systematically implemented and expanded the burh system laid out by their father. This was a quiet, relentless campaign of fortification and assertion of Anglo-Saxon power. Imagine the constant toil involved, the sounds of hammers on wood and stone echoing across the valleys, the rhythmic digging of ditches, the arduous construction of ramparts and palisades. Each new burh was a quiet assertion of Anglo-Saxon authority, a physical manifestation of their determined return. They weren't just building walls. They were rebuilding a future, one carefully constructed fortification at a time. These burhs were strategically placed, often at key river crossings, on high ground, or at crossroads, designed to control vital lines of communication and trade, and to serve as bases for offensive operations. From these secure points, Anglo-Saxon forces could launch sorties, harass Viking garrisons, and reclaim surrounding agricultural lands. The constant expansion of this defensive network meant that the Viking grip on the Danelaw was slowly, inexorably squeezed. It was a war of logistics and infrastructure as much as it was a war of battles. The very presence of a new burh would have sent a clear, quiet message to the Viking inhabitants of the area. Anglo-Saxon power was returning, steadily and powerfully. This slow, methodical advance was a testament to patience and strategic foresight, a quiet grinding away at Viking control, brick by painful brick, securing the land not with a single stroke, but with persistent effort. Unlike the fractured kingdoms of earlier times, a striking feature of Edward and Æthelflæd's reconquest was their remarkable strategic coordination. This represented a significant evolution in Anglo-Saxon warfare, demonstrating a new level of unity and purpose. Imagine their synchronized campaigns, often converging on Viking strongholds from different directions, creating a pincer movement that overwhelmed the defenders. This quiet, Effective partnership was a powerful weapon against a previously dominant enemy who had thrived on Anglo-Saxon disunity. For example, while Edward might campaign in the southeast, consolidating control over the 5 burhs of the Danelaw, Æthelflæd would be simultaneously pushing her forces through Mercia, reclaiming towns like Derby and Leicester. This coordinated pressure meant that Viking forces could not concentrate their strength in one area without leaving another vulnerable. The strategic foresight and mutual trust between brother and sister allowed for a highly efficient and relentless advance. The messages exchanged between them, the planning sessions, the shared understanding of their ultimate goal, all would have been conducted with a quiet efficiency that belied the immense scale of their undertaking. This unified front, born of shared purpose and familial trust, proved to be a formidable force, systematically dismantling the Viking presence in England. The quiet coordination was a silent testament to their strategic brilliance and shared vision, a marked departure from the disunity of previous generations. The reconquest of the Danelaw was not a single, dramatic battle that turned the tide in an instant. Instead, it was a long, arduous process, a quiet but relentless chipping away at Viking power. It involved a series of sieges, patiently conducted to starve out Viking garrisons, and numerous skirmishes, small but significant encounters that gradually weakened the enemy's hold. Towns that had long been under Viking control, once formidable strongholds of Norse power, gradually fell back into Anglo-Saxon hands. Imagine the methodical approach, besieging a town, cutting off its supplies, and waiting for hunger and desperation to force a surrender. Cities like Derby, Leicester, Nottingham, Stamford, and Lincoln, the so-called 5 burhs, had been vital centers of Viking power and settlement. Their recapture was not just a military victory but a profound symbolic one, representing the reassertion of Anglo-Saxon authority over land that had seemed irrevocably lost. This quiet, steady progress was a testament to the endurance of the Anglo-Saxon people and the strategic acumen of their leaders. It was a slow but inexorable tide, steadily washing away the Viking presence. Each reclaimed town, each re-established burh, was a small but significant step towards the eventual unification of England. The process was often painful, marked by suffering and sacrifice, but it was also characterized by a quiet determination to reclaim what was theirs, piece by hard-won piece. The sounds of Anglo-Saxon voices returning to these towns, replacing the Norse tongues, would have been a quiet, powerful symbol of their steady reclamation. The success of Edward and Æthelflæd solidified Anglo-Saxon dominance in central and southern England, marking a decisive shift in the balance of power. Their quiet, methodical campaign demonstrated unequivocally that the Vikings, despite their earlier triumphs, were not invincible. They had met their match in the disciplined, strategic, and unified efforts of Alfred's children. Their achievements paved the way for a truly unified English kingdom under their successors. Their legacy was one of quiet triumph, built meticulously on their father's vision and their own formidable capabilities. They had taken Alfred's blueprint and painstakingly brought it to life, systematically dismantling the fragmentation that had plagued Anglo-Saxon England for so long. The lands reclaimed, and the alliances forged all contributed to a growing sense of national cohesion. The long, slow process of reconquest, often overlooked in favor of more dramatic battles, was perhaps the most crucial phase in the forging of England. It was a period of sustained effort, quiet sacrifice, and remarkable strategic foresight, ultimately laying the groundwork for the powerful, unified English state that would emerge in the following century. The quiet resilience of this generation, the sons and daughter of Alfred, ensured that the seeds of unity sown in adversity would ultimately blossom into a powerful, cohesive nation. Our journey through the Anglo-Viking Wars now leads us to a period of consolidation and the quiet forging of a unified identity, culminating in the reign of a king who truly embodied the ambition of his grandfather, Alfred, and the strategic prowess of his father, Edward, and his aunt, Æthelflæd. This chapter will focus on Athelstan, the first king to wear the crown of a unified England, and the quiet, persistent efforts that led to this monumental achievement, including the complex political landscape he navigated and the final, decisive battles that secured his claim. Imagine a realm in constant flux, a tapestry woven with threads of Anglo-Saxon ambition, lingering Viking assertiveness, and the subtle, yet persistent, undercurrents of Celtic independence. Following the remarkable successes of Edward the Elder and Æthelflæd, the stage was set for the true unification of England, but it was by no means a straightforward path. The so-called Danelaw, while militarily weakened, still retained a distinct identity, its Norse populations and their customs a quiet counterpoint to the returning Anglo-Saxon authority. To the north and west, the Welsh kingdoms and the burgeoning Kingdom of Scotland, with their own ancient claims and fierce independence, watched the rise of Anglo-Saxon power with a mixture of apprehension and strategic interest. Athelstan, inheriting the throne from his father Edward, faced the immense challenge of not merely conquering, but truly integrating these diverse elements into a single, cohesive realm. He understood that military might alone would not suffice. He needed to be a statesman, a diplomat, and a legislator, quietly weaving the disparate threads into a durable fabric. This was a nuanced, delicate process, often involving careful negotiations, strategic marriages, and the subtle assertion of authority, rather than overt displays of force. He was building a nation, not just winning battles. Imagine the quiet discussions in his court, the meticulous crafting of treaties, the careful balancing of power, all aimed at creating a lasting peace and a unified identity. The lingering cultural differences, the distinct legal traditions, the memory of past conflicts, these were the silent challenges Athelstan had to overcome, not with a sword, but with quiet diplomacy and a vision for a shared future. He worked in the quiet spaces between conflict, carefully cultivating alliances and establishing a rule of law that could encompass the diverse peoples under his burgeoning dominion. Athelstan, even before his most famous military triumphs, established himself as a figure of immense authority through his astute diplomatic skills and the quiet, symbolic power he wielded. He cultivated alliances across the British Isles and even continental Europe, demonstrating a political sophistication rarely seen in his time. Imagine the quiet journeys of his envoys, carrying messages of peace and alliance to distant courts, forging bonds that would prove crucial in his later campaigns. He married his sisters into prominent European royal houses, creating a network of powerful connections that enhanced his prestige and provided a quiet buffer against potential threats. These were not random unions, but calculated moves on a vast geopolitical chessboard. Furthermore, Athelstan's court became a center of learning and lawmaking. He issued comprehensive law codes, meticulously crafted to bring order and consistency to a diverse realm. Imagine the quiet scribes, diligently copying legal texts, the debates among his advisors, all focused on establishing a just and orderly society. These laws addressed everything from trade and coinage to the suppression of crime, quietly laying the legal foundations for a unified state. His use of charters and coinage also served as powerful, yet subtle, tools of state building. Charters, meticulously documented and widely distributed, asserted his authority over land and people, while his coinage, bearing his image and title, circulated throughout his realm, a constant, quiet reminder of his central authority and the unity of his kingdom. These acts, often overlooked in favor of more dramatic military exploits, were the quiet, essential building blocks of a stable and enduring state, demonstrating his profound understanding of governance and his commitment to a unified English identity. He was building not just a kingdom, but a truly integrated realm, where the silent hum of administration and law provided the bedrock for lasting peace. The culmination of Athelstan's reign, and indeed a defining moment in the entire Anglo-Viking Wars, was the Battle of Brunanburh, fought in 937 AD. This was not just another engagement. It was a titanic clash, a veritable great war of its age, where the very future of a unified England hung in the balance. Athelstan faced an unprecedented coalition, a formidable alliance of Norse forces from Dublin and potentially other Viking settlements, led by Olaf Guthfrithson, Constantine II, the King of Scotland, and Owen I, the King of Strathclyde, a powerful Welsh kingdom. This was a silent and palpable recognition by these various powers that Athelstan's ambitions represented a fundamental threat to their own independence. Imagine the vastness of the armies converging, the quiet, ominous rumble of thousands of men on the move, the air thick with anticipation and dread. The location of Brunanburh remains debated, adding to its almost mythical quality, but its impact is undeniable. This battle was a desperate, prolonged struggle, fought with a ferocity born of the immense stakes. The Anglo-Saxon chronicles, though brief, describe a scene of horrific carnage, a great slaughter where the ground ran red with blood. The shield wall would have held firm, then buckled, then held again, as wave after wave of desperate fighters crashed against each other. The cries of men, the clang of steel, the thud of bodies falling. These were the grim sounds of a nation being forged in fire. Athelstan's decisive victory at Brunanburh was not merely a defeat of his enemies. It was a resounding confirmation of his supremacy throughout Britain. It effectively shattered the grand coalition against him, eliminating the last serious external threats to the nascent English kingdom. The battle served as a powerful declaration that England, under Athelstan, was a unified and formidable power, no longer merely a collection of Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. The echoes of Brunanburh resonated across Europe, establishing Athelstan as a king of significant international standing. This quiet, yet profoundly impactful, triumph marked the true birth of England as a single political entity, a culmination of centuries of struggle and the final, decisive chapter in the Anglo-Viking Wars for dominance. It was a silent, yet seismic, shift in the power dynamics of the British Isles. The legacy of Athelstan's reign extends far beyond his military triumphs. He was, in essence, the architect of a unified English state, a figure who quietly, yet profoundly, transformed a collection of kingdoms into a single, cohesive nation. His success was built on a multifaceted approach, a shrewd understanding of diplomacy, a commitment to legal reform, and an unyielding military resolve when necessary. Imagine the quiet, incremental changes that occurred during his reign. The standardization of laws, the increased circulation of a unified currency, the growing sense of shared identity among diverse peoples. These were the subtle signs of a nation truly coming together. Athelstan's court attracted scholars and churchmen from across Europe, making it a hub of intellectual activity and demonstrating England's growing cultural sophistication. He was a devout Christian, and his patronage of religious institutions further solidified the moral and spiritual foundations of his kingdom. This quiet cultural blossoming, often overshadowed by the drama of war, was an equally vital component of his nation-building efforts. The very idea of Englishness began to take on a more defined shape under his rule, a synthesis of Anglo-Saxon heritage and, perhaps surprisingly, elements of the Norse culture that had permeated parts of the land. His quiet, yet relentless, pursuit of unity laid the essential groundwork for all subsequent English monarchs. His was a reign that proved that true power lay not just in conquest, but in the careful, quiet integration of diverse peoples under a single, just rule. The quiet hum of a developing nation, steadily growing in strength and cohesion, was his enduring monument. Our final deep dive into the Anglo-Viking Wars brings us to its twilight, a period marked by renewed Viking aggression, the dramatic rise of a powerful Danish king who briefly united England under a foreign crown, and ultimately, the profound transformation brought about by a new, unforeseen conquest. This chapter will explore the return of the dragon's shadow under Æthelflæd the Unready, the imposing figure of Nut the Great, and the quiet, yet seismic, shift of the Norman conquest that fundamentally reshaped England, bringing the Anglo-Viking saga to its conclusive end. Imagine a kingdom once again vulnerable, its hard-won unity slowly eroding under renewed pressure. After the strength and stability of kings like Athelstan and Edgar, England entered a period of internal weakness and renewed external threats under Æthelflæd II, often, though perhaps unfairly, known as the Unready, a mistranslation of meaning ill-advised or poorly counseled. This was a time when the strategic foresight of his predecessors seemed to have faded, replaced by a series of reactive, often ill-conceived, policies that left the kingdom open to renewed Viking depredations. The late 10th and early 11th centuries saw a resurgence of large-scale Viking raids, this time often led by powerful figures like Sweyn Forkbeard of Denmark and later, his son Nut. These were not the relatively small-scale incursions of the early Viking Age. These were sustained, systematic campaigns aimed at extracting vast sums of tribute, known as danegeld, increasingly, at outright conquest. Imagine the quiet despair that would have settled over the land as these demands grew, year after year, draining the kingdom's resources and demoralizing its people. The payment of danegeld, intended to buy peace, often only served to embolden the raiders, demonstrating England's weakness and encouraging further demands. Æthelred's reign was characterized by a quiet instability, a sense of drifting without clear direction. His attempts to resist were often hampered by internal dissent, betrayals, and a lack of consistent military success. The massacre of St. Brice's Day in 1002, a desperate attempt to eliminate the Danes within England, only provoked a brutal and sustained response from Sweyn Forkbeard, leading to years of relentless warfare and devastation. The quiet anxieties of his subjects would have grown with each passing season, each new demand for danegeld, each fresh report of Viking devastation. This period was a somber prelude to the dramatic shift in power that was to come, a quiet testament to the fragility of peace when leadership faltered and internal divisions festered. The shadows were lengthening once more over the land, heralding a new and final phase of the Anglo-Viking struggle. From this period of English weakness emerged one of the most formidable figures of the early medieval period, Nut the Great. Son of Sweyn Forkbeard, Nut completed his father's conquest of England, forcing Æthelred into exile and eventually establishing himself as King of England in 1016. Imagine the sheer ambition and military prowess of a man who could achieve such a feat, but Nut was more than just a conqueror. He was a remarkable statesman, a figure who quietly, yet profoundly, united a vast North Sea empire. His reign over England, though initially marked by the violence of conquest, quickly transitioned into a period of surprising stability and prosperity. Nut understood that to rule effectively, he needed the cooperation of the Anglo-Saxon elite and the respect of the Church. He famously sent many of his Viking warriors home, integrated Anglo-Saxons into his administration, and demonstrated profound respect for English laws and customs. Imagine the quiet shift in the atmosphere of the court. from one of foreign occupation to one of integrated rule, where Danish and English magnates worked side by side. He adopted a conciliatory approach, rebuilding churches and monasteries that had been damaged during the years of conflict, and promoting peace and order throughout his new realm. Knut's empire stretched across England, Denmark, and Norway, a vast dominion united under a single crown. This was a unique political entity, a quiet testament to his extraordinary leadership. His reign in England was characterized by a strong, centralized government and a period of relative peace, offering a stark contrast to the preceding decades of chaos. He ruled as a legitimate Christian king, even undertaking a pilgrimage to Rome, further solidifying his standing on the international stage. His quiet, yet firm, hand brought an end to the ceaseless Anglo-Viking warfare, not through eradication, but through absorption. He demonstrated that peace could be found in a shared kingdom, rather than constant conflict. The quiet hum of a new, unified, and powerful Anglo-Danish realm echoed across the North Sea. Knut's vast North Sea empire, a testament to his ambition and strategic genius, was ultimately a deeply personal creation, rather than a firmly institutionalized state. Despite its impressive size and Knut's ability to hold it together during his lifetime, it proved to be a fragile construct. After his death in 1035, the empire quickly fragmented, unable to withstand the pressures of internal rivalries and the lack of a strong successor capable of commanding the diverse loyalties of its constituent parts. Imagine the slow, quiet unraveling of this grand design, as ambitious earls and princes vied for power, and the bonds that Knut had meticulously forged began to fray. England, having been absorbed into this larger Danish dominion, now found itself in a period of complex dynastic struggle. The brief reigns of Knut's sons, Harold Harefoot and Harthach Knut, were marked by continued instability and uncertainty, with rival claimants to the throne vying for power. This was a time of quiet anxiety and political maneuvering, as the Anglo-Saxon elite sought to regain control while various Norse claimants asserted their own rights. Ultimately, the Anglo-Saxon line was restored with the return of Edward the Confessor, son of Æthelflæd II, from exile in Normandy in 1042. His reign, while initially welcomed as a return to traditional English rule, was complex. Edward had strong Norman ties, having spent much of his life in Normandy, and his court began to reflect this influence. This subtle, quiet shift, often unnoticed by the common people, was a profound prelude to the final, decisive turning point in English history. The seeds of a new conquest were quietly being sown, not by a Viking axe, but by a Norman influence that would reshape the very fabric of England. The quiet ending of the Anglo-Danish Empire was merely a pause before a new, even more profound, transformation. The year 1066 stands as a monumental watershed, not just in English history, but in the entire saga of the Anglo-Viking Wars. It represents the quiet, yet cataclysmic, end of one era and the violent birth of another. Following the death of Edward the Confessor without a clear heir, a succession crisis erupted, leading to a series of events that would forever alter the course of England. Imagine the tension in the air as three powerful claimants emerged, each with their own legitimate, or perceived legitimate, claim to the English throne. Harold Godwin's son, the most powerful English earl, was crowned king, representing the continuity of Anglo-Saxon rule. However, his claim was immediately challenged by Harald Hardrada, the formidable king of Norway, a true Viking in the old mold, who launched a massive invasion in the north. This was the last great Viking invasion of England, a final, brutal echo of the dragon's shadow that had first fallen centuries before. Simultaneously, William, Duke of Normandy, a distant cousin of Edward the Confessor, also asserted his claim, preparing a vast invasion fleet across the English Channel. The Battle of Stamford Bridge, where Harold Godwin's son decisively defeated Harold Hardrada and his Norwegian forces, was a final, glorious Anglo-Saxon triumph over the Viking threat. Imagine the exhaustion, the quiet relief that would have followed this brutal victory. However, this hard-won triumph came at an immense cost, leaving Harold's army depleted and exhausted. Just days later, William's Norman forces landed at Pevensey Bay, forcing Harold to undertake a grueling forced march south. The Battle of Hastings, fought on October 14, 1066, was a decisive engagement. Here, the Anglo-Saxon shield wall, weakened and weary, ultimately succumbed to the combined might of Norman cavalry and archers. Harold Godwin's son himself was killed, marking the end of Anglo-Saxon rule and the commencement of the Norman conquest. This was the quiet, yet definitive, closing of the Anglo-Viking Age. The Normans, though descendants of Vikings who had settled in France, brought with them a distinct culture, language, French, and legal system that rapidly supplanted the existing Anglo-Saxon and Norse influences. The Norman conquest fundamentally reshaped England, its institutions, and its very identity, absorbing and transforming the Anglo-Saxon and Viking elements into a new, unique culture. It was the quiet closing of a long, bloody chapter, the final act in a multi-century drama that had seen England forge in the crucible of invasion and resistance. The quiet echoes of a bygone era still lingered, but a new, profound silence had fallen, paving the way for a distinctly new England.